Thank you. I happen to know that there's a woman in the audience that has a good idea of how many cookbooks we have in the cookbook collection. Doreen, where are you at right now?
I have 756 online.
Okay. So Doreen has been creating a table and a study of each. And I always know she's hit a good cookbook when she gets up and goes to make a photocopy. I know there's a recipe to be had. Thank you, Doreen. We figure she's got between 50 and 100 more books to go. So I'm really hoping that we break 800. Really am. I think we'll do that. Okay. I cannot thank you enough for coming in amongst the slush, but it's so much better than 20 below. So there's hope. For those of you who have heard this spiel before, my apologies, but I can never say it enough. I work for the Montana Historical Society Research Center. If you say, oh, how's the museum work going? I won't know what you're talking about. This amazing place has 5 programs, and fortunately there's some colleagues in who will help me because I often have trouble. So of course, the most obvious program is the museum. The museum and the people who work at the museum for the museum program deal with 3-dimensional objects. For instance, if you were to donate that scarf after I was done with it, it would go to the museum. Or if you have a football that belonged to your grandfather, or your mother's wedding dress. And don't think, oh, my parents got married in the 50s, that's not old. Believe it or not, they are such a part of our history. Even if someone got married last week, that wedding dress is part of our material culture. So, and they also then are amazing staff down there put together the exhibits that you see. And if you've not seen World War I exhibit, please, please, please go see it. I think it's amazing. It is amazing. All right, so that was the museum. State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, manages preservation, whether it's archaeological sites or wonderful old structures. They also have a database with a whole bunch of information on the historic registry. Okay, John Boughton, especially, he's my go-to guy over there, though wonderful. Then we've got publications, kind of self-explanatory. They publish our journal 4 times a year, and then every once in a while they gift us with a book. Then we have outreach and interpretation. I call them education, because to me that's what they are. They go forth and educate, or they have folks like Ellen Baumler and Martha Cole who educate from their computers or go out and do outreach. Amazing knowledge there about Montana history. And then we get into my territory. And if you say, what's happening in the research center, I can jump to it. I know that answer. The research center is the largest program in this building. We are accessible Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5, up in the library. That does not mean we don't work on Mondays. It just means we're working without the public coming and going. We have been collecting since 1865. We have 3 sub-programs. There is the library, which is the collection of the printed word. Montana newspapers that date back to 1864. And then yesterday's Lewistown Argus, if you're interested. Right? That's one of our, one of the most dear projects is to maintain those small town newspapers. And then we have and that's the library too, of course, lots of great books. Then we have the photo archives, about 500,000 photos. Oh my gosh, if you're a visual person, my favorite is L.A. Huffman. If you like cowboys, it gets even better with L.A. Huffman. He just was amazing. We have his collection. We have so many collections that date back over a century. If you're not familiar with L.A. Huffman, he came in as a military photographer, Fort Keogh, outside of what is now Miles City. And then when he retired from the military, fortunately for the people of Montana, he stayed in Miles City, and he documented by photo the end of the Big Range era. If you're familiar with eastern Montana, I want you to visualize the Powder River country, and it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to imagine the Powder River. It's like that. But his pictures of roundups on the Powder River country are breathtaking to me. So that's just one of hundreds of collections. And then we have the archives, and that is where I have spent a good share of my time in preparing for this presentation. Archives, by the way, we use it, means the original documents. We have the documents created by the Montana Council of Defense, not the nicest people on the block. And when I say that, I mean these are their papers. These are the papers they received. These are the papers they sent out. We have, what else did I get into? Oh my gosh. The Council of Defense. Also, I got into some wonderful governor's records, although I did not copy those, but we have a couple of collections from Janette Rankin when she was in Washington, D.C. And so we are allowed this wonderful opportunity to read the letters she was getting from mostly the women of Montana. And as I get into this presentation, if you think everybody was thinking the same thing, oh my gosh, think again. Because I believe, because she was a woman, that a lot of women felt safe confiding in her. All right. So Hooverizing. We're going to learn that Hooverizing got its name from J. Edgar Hoover. And going into World War I, we see this amazing situation where, well, it's not unusual for politics and food to come together. But women are brought into the story, and not just brought into the story and the projects, but women are targeted. In a good way, in a bad way, quite honestly, that's going to be for you to decide. All right, so we've got politics, food, and women. And here we go. It's a good thing I knew what I was talking about before okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to have just a brief World War I timeline. And then I will talk about the Lever Act, and believe it or not, it was with the Lever Act, as it was going up to vote, that Janette Rankin, and they call it in the newspaper her maiden speech. I sometimes question whether if a man was doing it, it would have been his maiden speech. Probably not. But that's how the newspapers sold it. Okay, she did not make a speech when she voted no for the war. She said 2 sentences, and I'll let you do the research to find out what those were. But her maiden speech was for the Lever Act. Then I'm going to talk about Herbert Hoover, women's voices. And that's going to involve Rankin's constituents, the Council of Defense, and then how they really felt, and so much more. So here we go. Let's do the timeline real quick. It's vital or important that Europe had been at war since 1914. Now, this is one of the things that makes the United States so unique during this time, and quite honestly, so incredibly fortunate. Within a couple of years, imagine the landscape of Europe. Imagine their infrastructure. There probably was not infrastructure. Imagine what little was left of their food production processes. So very early on, the United States began shipping food to Europe, especially Belgium. Janette Rankin is elected to Congress in 1916, and that's always important to remember because women did not receive full suffrage in the United States until 1920. So there were a lot of women who were living in states that they couldn't vote yet, and yet here Montana has a female representative. Relief efforts, again, right away, and that's important because of Hoover's background. And then I like to talk about the Zimmermann telegram. And if you're not familiar, anybody heard of the Zimmermann telegram? See, this is, so we have been held back from war, and the United States was very isolationist. Right? There are a lot of people that believed we did not need to get involved in Europeans' issues. And then in January of 1917, the Germans send a telegram to Mexico. And this is where it starts getting way too close to home. And I have to read that because otherwise I get, here we go. So it was a secret diplomatic communication issued from the German Foreign Office that proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. And then prior to the event of the United States entering World War I against Germany, they explained, they offered, if Germany became victorious, Mexico would recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Again, this is getting too close to home. By April 6th, on April 6th, the United States declared war. Shortly after that, we have the Lever Act. We're going to talk about that. And then just to get a sense of the chaos in Montana, the speculator mine disaster. Our men start showing up, those who hadn't been over there already, as volunteers. U.S. forces arrive in France in June. August 1st, Frank Little is lynched in Butte. And then the Food Administration is created August 10th. Going into February, we've got February 14th, Montana Special Session. And we're going to talk about that. The special session empowers the Council of Defense. Again, we're going to talk about this in a bit. And they create sedition laws. They require, with the lobbying of the Council of Defense, then the Montana legislature also initiates some gun control. And then we have the October through November, and actually through a good share of that winter, the influenza epidemic. That we've found out is actually the second wave of the influenza. And then November 11th, the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. I might have said that backwards. Armistice. But the American Relief Administration keeps on going. All right. So first, the Lever Act. As the United States went into war, the administrators on a national level realized that there were some things that they didn't know much about yet. And the Lever Act was created to give funding for surveys of food coming and going, production, transportation, and on and on. It also sort of created the Food Administration. It also created the Fuel Administration, but that's about coal, and we're not going to talk about coal today. No one's from Roundup, right? Or Red Lodge? Okay, we're not going to talk about coal. This is when Janette Rankin makes her maiden speech. And this is some of the stuff she said. So she gets up and asks for an amendment. And she says, and when these activities are so clearly related to the home, as is the food question, women are especially well fitted by their training and experience to do this work. It is self-evident that women are going to fill many positions that have been filled by men in the past, and this is one of the places where they can be used effectively. By using women officials to aid in this work, we will concentrate the attention of all women on the larger bearings of the food problem. It will bring the home woman, so the housewives, into closer cooperation with the government. Well, interestingly enough, this is not the first or last time we hear about women. As soon as the Lever Act is passed, Hoover is brought from Europe to, see, that's the problem with this. I have to keep track of it. To manage the Food Administration. So 1/2 of the Lever Act. And in one of his opening speeches, he says, the effectiveness of these rules is dependent solely upon the goodwill of and the willingness to sacrifice by the American people. In the last analysis, the success or failure of any plan such as that here outlined rests with the people. We are dependent upon the cooperation of the trades. We have but one police force, the American woman. And we depend upon her to organize in cooperation with our state, and then it goes on. And then he finishes by saying the self-sacrifice necessary to render such measures effective. The small minority who refuse to cooperate shall not be allowed to defeat the nation's necessities. Ooh. So the Food Administration is created. And again, I'm going to talk about Hoover in just a moment. But I'm sure you've all seen, whether you're reading or going through a museum or just in I'm not sure I've ever seen a World War I poster in an antique store. If I had, it was probably so expensive I didn't look twice at it. But you see reproductions of World War I posters, and they're quite amazing. And Hoover says, we propose to mobilize the spirit of self-denial and self-sacrifice in this country. And the Food Administration is going to turn its attention on everything to do with food, from the seeds and planting to preparation, through preparation to shipping to Europe, to not just our men in Europe, but to those allies who are quite honestly starving to death. The interesting thing here is this is where there's only one term for this. This is where the Montana and U.S. women start getting hit with endless propaganda. And I'm going to leave that up to you, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, or it just was. And I hope we can talk about that afterwards. Hoover was an advertising genius, and he successfully surrounded himself with advertising geniuses. And a little bit about advertising from this time. Has anybody been lucky enough to see a 1918 Ladies' Home Journal? Oh, they're so cool. That's where Norman Rockwell and Maxfield Parrish and a myriad of artists that we consider just our base of art, that's where they get their start, is in graphic art. Norman Rockwell has art out there advertising Jell-O. He does, and it's just great. It's great stuff. But this is the era where advertising comes into its own because of the media, because of the magazines that are coming out, because of the newspapers. Remember, we still don't have radio, and we certainly don't have the internet for information, okay? So from planting to preparation, and quite honestly, they are going to be in every kitchen with one exception, and we're going to talk about that. As soon as Hoover steps up and starts promoting the Food Administration, Wilson, of course, gets up. And he writes a letter. And the letter says, the women of the nation are already earnestly seeking to do their part in this, our greatest struggle for the maintenance of our national ideals, and in no direction can they so greatly assist as by enlisting in the service of the Food Administration and cheerfully accepting its direction and advice. I trust, therefore, that the women of the country will not only respond to your appeal, and this is addressing Hoover and the rest of the country, and accept the pledge to the Food Administration which you are proposing, but that all men also who are engaged in the personal distribution of foods will cooperate with the same earnestness. And we're only just starting. Okay, Herbert Hoover. And Hoover gets a really bad rap because, unfortunately, he happens to be the president, and not just happens, but yeah, he's the president when the worst of the Depression hits the United States. And that is another presentation, or another 5 books. But right now we're going to talk about him, and he's a young man. He was born in Iowa. His parents were Quakers. He was orphaned at 9, if you could imagine. He winds up going to, I have to look, Stanford, and becomes a geologist, which evolves into engineering. And he makes a name for himself and a whole lot of money very early in life. One of his expertise is the logistics needed to get people up to a mine, establish a mining site and a community, and to keep them provided with supplies. He is logistically gifted, I would say. Not something that all of us have. He, very early in life, acquires a reputation for humanitarianisms and humanitarian actions. And he is in England when the US declares war against Germany, and the embassy is deluged with US citizens, some of them without money to get home, on and on and on. So he establishes a relief fund and starts helping these folks. And then prior to that, he had established a relief fund for the folks in Belgium. So he's acquired and relief food and clothes. Food and clothes. So he has acquired a really significant and well-earned reputation for doing exactly what the Food Administration needs him to do. As he goes into this, he starts focusing on propaganda, for lack of a different term. So a couple of quotes that come out of his letters. Let's see if I can find the best one. He is against, I think that's the next slide. He is against rules and enforced rationing. And he declares it's because it's going to require people a whole bunch of administrators who will then be controlling people in the long and the short of it. All right. Here it is. He talks about rules being set forth about using food and fuel. Part of the rules will be enforced under the Lever of Food Act. Other parts are voluntary and will depend for their success upon public sentiment. Our experience hitherto has shown a willingness of the vast majority of the consumers and a full cooperation of the trades to undergo the self-sacrifice. Is there a theme coming on here? Self-sacrifice necessary to render such measures effective. The small minority, here again, who refuse to cooperate will not be allowed. So food will win the war. Food will win the war. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to, there we go. Let's talk about the posters first. Okay? Now, Hoover very methodically convinced the American consciousness what he publicly referred to as the public mind, that food would win the war. Real patriots conserved, substituted, and knew how to manage their kitchens effectively to promote the outcome of the war. In a 1917 Saturday Evening Post interview, he explained that the world lived by phrases. And now, because the food is going to win the war, food becomes a weapon on so many levels. And the American public is convinced that they have a weapon at their fingertips that they can wield and control. This turns out to be an outrageously successful program, and I'm going to go back now. All right. the posters were just the beginning. The posters are what the everyday woman would have seen going to the grocery store, going to the library, maybe even going to church. What we don't hear about often is the amazing effort put forth by the federal and state governments to educate. A publication that's about 300 pages is sent to women of the universities and colleges, to every university and college in the country. And we're going to address the reaction to that in a little bit. But one of the things that many of us may or may not be familiar with are, today they come from our county extension office, but the Department of Agriculture created bulletins. And Janette Rankin sent a letter to every one of her constituents saying that if they wanted, with a list of the bulletins and their titles, if they wanted a bulletin, all they had to do was circle the number and get this back to her. I'm going to ask you to be really careful because this does say sent by Janette Rankin, and I kind of like it. None of these are part of our collection because, quite honestly, they don't like it when I cart things off. They are unreasonable. So farmers' bulletins are everything from food for children, how to bake bread, how to put up chicken coops, how to raise your own garden. There were education opportunities for every woman's, every homemaker's interest. And then they hit the media. We've got newspapers and magazines. So the newspaper that I've copied is from the LIR, May 1917, and the front page has 3 different articles on food production. And there are lots of PR, lots of goodwill. You know, we're going to kick the Germans' butt because we can grow all the wheat that's necessary. The front page of the IR. And then every woman's magazine had articles. I've already mentioned that the Saturday Evening Post was quoting Hoover, and this was an article written by Janette Rankin. Okay, here we go. Women should prepare themselves not only for a thrifty administration within their own kitchens, but also for professional and paid work. What? Which must be done in connection with public food kitchens, free school lunches, and other forms of community feeding. She was a little bit of a radical. Let us, by all means, urge the housewives not to waste a single slice of bread or an ounce of meat. But let us also assure them that they in turn shall be protected, against the far more wanton waste of the food speculator. Oh. She refers to collective motherhood and on and on. Oh, this is interesting. What is needed is not wholesale self-denial, but right utilization. So again, get educated. And we have opportunities to get educated. This is great stuff. I've been talking for a while. Any questions yet? That could be good or that could be bad. All right. Now, we did that. What was asked to be rationed? What was going on? What was the rationale? And that's what I wanted to know. What was the rationale behind what was they wanted people to conserve and what we could use? It's kind of surprising. So, but it makes perfect sense. Foods that were easily transportable or, quite honestly, canned. Wheat, butter, lard, sugar, bacon, beef, and pork. Notice eggs aren't on there. Thank heaven for the number of homesteaders that had chickens. So the public was encouraged to use corn, oats, barley, rye, molasses, and honey, chicken, eggs, nuts, and fish. Right? The public was urged to eat local foods. Some things are just go in such cycles, isn't it? They were encouraged to use substitutions, and I know that there were programs where households would have, if you wanted, say, 5 pounds of wheat flour, you had to buy so much barley or so much rye as well. Okay, so one way or the other, there were some controls out there. Gardens. There were home demonstrators going out all over the country showing women how to can. Children's clubs were initiated. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but they were big time in Montana. And it's no coincidence that this is about the time that our own Farm Bureau is created. We see the seeds of our, no pun intended, the seeds of our Farm Bureau being sown across the state. And use leftovers. And that's kind of interesting because if you've ever read a book, let's say from the 1890s, often a cookbook, often they have whole chapters on what to do with old bread. So using leftovers was not a surprise to a lot of women, right? Amazing, amazing times. All right, and then, so we have the Food Administration, we have the federal government, who's putting out all this PR, all this advertisement. Women, you can help us win the war. You can win the war. You're going to conserve. You're going to not use sugar because it's going to feed your son who's overseas right now. It goes on and on. And it's clear by the advertisements that there's a lot of implications or a lot of hints that, do expect a little self-denial, contrary to what Janette Rankin may say. You have to sacrifice because we have men and boys who are sacrificing on the other side of the Atlantic, right? But the Montana Council of Defense kind of comes to a whole new low. So in February of 1918, Sam Stewart, the governor at that time, calls a special session because we're knee-deep in the war, and he is trying to prepare Montana. Do I have that right? I want to say it was, 1918. Okay. He is, quite honestly, the government, the state, the people are all trying to survive the war. One of the national programs created by Wilson was the Council of Defense, and every state was instructed to create their own Council of Defense to take care of, as it says, perform all acts and things necessary or proper so that the military, civil, and industrial resources of the state may be most efficiently applied towards the maintenance of the defense of the state and the nation. And initially, they were meant to worry about logistics, have the seeds that the farmers needed gotten to them, all right? So if the women are canning, do they have canning jars? That sort of thing. Montana's Council of Defense just went a little crazy. What can I say? According to Governor Stewart's opening address, every resource of the state should be made to yield its full product and with the least possible expenditure of manpower and expense. And every individual should realize that his or her efforts must be exerted in conjunction, in full accord, and in complete harmony with the efforts of every other individual in the state. Good Lord. I don't even have that in my own household, and I live alone. I would not only recommend that the State Council of Defense be made a legal entity and clothed with legal authority, but I recommend, in addition to this, that an appropriation be made. In other words, we're going to support them financially. Oh my goodness. Here is an example, and we have Again, the Council of Defense records in our archives. And that is one of the amazing magic of this building, is how many original pieces are kept here, whether it's a wedding dress or the Council of Defense records. Because you know what? There's no hiding if original documents can be read. And here is an exchange. So the Council of Defense has received several letters from farmers who have neighbors whose stock is getting into their crops. And we all know, if you don't, you're about to, that Montana is an open range state. It would have been even more so in 1918. And so lots of complaints. And this is the response, not just from the Montana State Council of Defense, but from the national. If it is not possible to handle this thing under existing laws, the next best thing to do, I presume, will be to use, and this is the phrase, moral suasion. Moral suasion. With those who are permitting their stock to roam, and put it up to them on the grounds of patriotism that they shall see that their cattle are not allowed to go where they will destroy crops. Moral suasion. To me, that is quite a phrase. Now, what the heck is moral suasion? And how do you introduce it? Do you introduce it with the club? Do you introduce it with the Bible? Do you have the U.S. Constitution on your lap? Think on this. Moral suasion with a neighbor that's already ticked you off. And my guess is you've ticked him off too. All right. The Council of Defense. Now, what about the women? The Rankin letters that I mentioned earlier are fascinating. And women, just like every other generation, every woman, every person has a different opinion. There's one 3-page letter that goes on and on that there's still grain being sold to alcohol distilleries. There are men making alcohol out of grain. What the heck is that about? Letters a lot complaining that the rye, the barley, all the items that they're using to get their wheat to go further, their prices are higher than wheat used to be. One woman even sent her grocery receipts, her handwritten grocery receipts. And she proves it. The rye and the barley are more expensive. And yet, here we've got a government that is expecting her to use that rye and barley. We have, she received lots of letters. After her speech going into the Lever Act, and by the way, the Lever Act was amended, and according to the wording of that act, women were going to be hired whenever possible. She's deluged with letters from women who want employment. And they're sending, well, I've been the secretary, I've been an administrator, administrative assistant was secretary. Sending her all their qualifications. Women are starting to get excited about this. And then there are those folks, women, who complain about the lack of supplies. All right, who do I have next? Evelyn Cameron. Evelyn Cameron liked food. If you've ever gotten into her diaries, she talks about what she eats. Her cookbook was Mrs. Lincoln's something or something other, Mrs. Lincoln out of Boston. Mrs. Lincoln's Boston cookbook. It took me a while. And she writes in her diary, went to bed with Mrs. Lincoln. I made Mrs. Lincoln's #2 vanilla ice cream. So that's a wonderful insight, and she just makes me smile. But on November 29th, 1917, she describes attending a dinner at a neighbor's house. Several people are there. I'm going to say at least a dozen or more people. They have tomato soup, turkey, coleslaw, rutabagas, mashed potato, cranberry sauce. Although Mr. Hoover says we are not to eat a lot of this year. Apple pie, fruit, ice cream. I think there was coffee cake. So they're certainly aware of what Mr. Hoover wants them to do, but the reality is they're out on a farm. And then certainly one of the most delightful stories comes out of Dan Cushman's book of his childhood, Plenty of Room and Air. And he talks about his mother struggling with the substitutions and bread recipes and whatnot. And he says there was a recipe in the paper for Liberty bread, and Mama baked some. It turned out to be heavy and ill-smelling. A soggy gray pumpernickel. Nobody would eat it, not even Pa, who could always be depended upon to take second helpings with hearty praise. Mama fed her Liberty War bread to the chickens. They got the substitute flour. She boiled it into a mash, and the chickens ate it. She says, there's nothing in the world wrong with feeding that stuff to the chickens, because if you didn't, you'd just have to buy grain. It's just as important to produce eggs and meat. She's got a point. It's as anything else. If something was actually being wasted, it would be different. Some people threw their substitute flours on the dump, according to Cushman. A thing that is terrible, Mama would report. It's waste. They ought to catch them and give it to them proper and good. Well, we ate, according to Cushman, war bread only in a different form, as white bread, eggs, and fried chicken, a good common sense solution. Fun. And then we have Janette Kelly. She graduated from Montana State University, Bozeman, in 1917, just about the time that they would have been receiving that tome on food and women getting involved and educating themselves with food. She graduates from the home ec department, and she winds up getting a job as a home demonstrator, and I think she may have been the first home demonstrator for Stillwater County. Her records at the not the University of Montana, Montana State University in Bozeman. And she was doing home demonstration. She was beginning boys and girls clubs, and the clubs were anything from baking bread to raising chickens. And that job leads her to eventually work for what we consider General Mills. Does anybody have that wonderful 1950 red and white colonial cloth cookbook from their mother? Or not? I've got one, but it's not from my mom. Well, she was the powerhouse behind that. She she was trained scientifically. And she went back east and started creating test kitchens for different magazines, and she wound up then at General Mills. And we're going to talk about her again in a little bit. All right. Janette Kelly. And I'm going to wait and talk about that quote. All right. So the next is for the Germans, because of what I found in my research, all right? If you're familiar with Montana history, you know that the 1910 census reported that more than half of Montana's population was an immigrant or child of an immigrant. Over almost 27,000 people in 1910 were German-born or born of German parents, right? One of the things the Council of Defense did was outlaw the German language. Let's see. Again, proof. There we got it. You had to have a steady job. Here we go. Order number 3, it is hereby ordered by the Montana Council of Defense that the use of the German language in public and private schools and in the pulpits of the state be, and the same is hereby forbidden. It is further ordered that the following named, and then it gives a list of publications from German scholars have to be destroyed. 1918. All right. So that raises the conundrum. April 1918. And initially, this sounds so great. To the Montana State Council of Defense. In a campaign of education of cooking, the new substitute recipes have been printed in the German language at Laurel, Miles City, and other points of distribution. This week, your representative in Miles City refused to allow these recipes circulated. If this comes under your recent rule regarding the use of German in Montana, we shall be very glad to call in the recipes. Will you please inform us concerning the prohibiting against such an article? Would the publication of posters and recipes in Finnish and Italian language also be prohibited? And the council's response just 3 days later, going to Bozeman. Dear sir, replying to yours of April 26th, in which you desire to know whether, under the order of the Montana Council of Defense, the circulation of recipes printed in German is prohibited in the state, I will say it is. As to the publication of posters and recipes in the Finnish and Italian languages, I will say that the order does not refer to any language save that of the German. So if you're a German housewife, especially if you don't speak English well, you're kind of between a rock and a hard spot here. And then, this little article there to the left. Janette Kelly, in her capacity as home demonstration, held a demonstration in Columbus January 27th, 1919. So this was after armistice. And she was speaking and demonstrating before a crowd of women, none of whom could understand a word she said. It happened in a special meeting in Yellowstone County, arranged especially for the German-Russian women living in the community around Laurel. Miss Kelly mixed and stirred, baked, and explained a public-spirited woman of Laurel. Mrs. Larson was there to translate. And this is how the article ends. It was one of the most practical pieces of Americanization work ever done in Montana. The women were eager and grateful and went away with a better understanding how to be a patriotic American and help save food to win the war. And I'm going to give you a quote that a colleague gave me this morning. She said, thank heaven the recipes survived. And I will say yes because I have my mother's cinnamon twists, I have her pfeffernusse, and my grandmother's kuchen recipes. And that, as you all know, there's nothing like a taste from the past. So the recipes survived in spite of the prohibitions if you were German. All right. But then, I've been kind of hard on people. I admit it. But let's talk about those cookbooks. The Montana Historical Society cookbook collection contains 3 cookbooks published during this time. And they are to me, one of our jewels. Women's cookbooks, specifically community cookbooks, are jewels because when you think about it, they're like women's directories. There are going to be women's names in print there, and you're not going to find their name anywhere else except in their obituary. All right? So we have 3 communities that we know of. I know that there are more out there, and I just pray that they wind up landing here someday, or that we find out where they're at so we can go play with them. We've got one from Hot Springs. That was by the Red Cross group up there. Butte came from the Young Ladies Society at St. Francis Xavier's Church. And then Butte was from the First Baptist Church. And it was Missoula that came from St. X. Right? These are wonderful. And I do have copies of various pages. They have not just the women's names, but the recipes. And the nice thing that you can depend on when you look at community cookbooks is they were recipes the women were traditionally proud of. And so hopefully you're not going to bake soggy war bread. No promises, but I can't help but think Mrs. Cushman would have benefited from one of these cookbooks. The advertisers are history into themselves. But the spirit of the women is to be acknowledged. Out of the Red Cross cookbook from Hot Springs of all places. In the introduction, and the other two books don't have introductions. Our object in getting up this book wasn't for the recipes and money derived from sale of book only, but we wished the book to serve as a memento of these stirring history-making times when we showed the world and each other that we could be true red-blooded Americans in every sense of the word, eat, play, work, save, and give as one. That's lovely. And to me, that speaks to what all that propaganda was about. To eat and play and save as one. All right. So what happened with all that patriotism, food, and those women? And of course, that's a good question. And that is another talk. But I can say that the Food Administration under Hoover was within just a few months absolved, but it became the Relief Administration. So for a couple of years yet, the administration, the Food Administration, was gathering food and clothes to support the Allies. And my guess is some of that made it to Germany too, those wicked Germans. Hoover was very, very good at that, and he was a humanitarian. The total food delivered to Europe during and after the war, are you ready for this, was 16,925 tons of food. Montana state agriculture production was up 30%, which is amazing because we had a drought starting. After the war, of course, the many people who had been in the administration wing of this got back to their own lives. And in the paper, we have an interview from the administrator in Bozeman, and he writes, let's see. He voices his appreciation for the work done in Montana during the past year by county food administrators, declaring that they were the active agents who made possible the success of food conservation. So we've got all those folks returning to their life. Now then, though, what happens to the women? And at this time, I'm going to remind you that in 1920, women on the national level, the 19th Amendment, get the vote. Then we go into an era where women start kicking up their heels. We have a short little flash of the flappers, and they were very short-lived, but oh, they were scandalous, scandalous. We see more women going into professions. We see more women going into college. And so that is where I like to end, is with the women. The women all over the country had been barraged and targeted by government propaganda to use the home front as a weapon. And they did. They stepped forth and they used the home front on many levels as a weapon. As you know, the U.S. did win that war. Sadly, there's going to be another war in another generation, but that's, again, another talk. And so there was so much propaganda, so many great words, so many phrases. But coming out of there, it appears to me that women were empowered during that time when they hadn't been before. And I believe they made the best of it. I cringe when I think of those women who were German and ostracized, but the women who may have had different political views were also ostracized. And there's one woman who was sent to prison out of, I want to say, Custer County, is one of those eastern counties, for siding with her husband when he spews sedition. So I leave that up to you, because this was a very complex time in U.S. history. It was vital that U.S. and her allies win that war. So I'll let you determine whether that propaganda was used for good or for bad. But I hope you leave understanding what an amazing time it was in our history, especially Montana's history. And I would like to get some input about what you think of that propaganda. Nothing? Oh, thank you, Nancy. Go for it.